Not very long ago, a senior IAS officer from Telangana cadre had to bear the brunt because the individual had presented their own views on the Bilkis Bano case. In another instance, a senior IAS officer from the Madhya Pradesh cadre was again held accountable for his comments on the movie The Kashmir Files. Now, this brings into focus the topic for the discussion of the day. Today, we take a look at the Civil Service Conduct Rules, the rules that govern an individual who is selected to become a part of the steel frame of India. Namaskar, good evening, and welcome to this special presentation by Study IQ IAS English. I am Bhuvan Apurvacha. As today, we take a look at the comprehensive structure of those rules and regulations that define the conduct of a civil servant in India. But before we go forward, it is imperative for us to understand that the conduct rules are bifurcated. Why? Well, because there are two different sorts of civil service. There are two different regulations, two different structures in place. Now, number one, we have the AIS Conduct Rules of 1968, the All India Service Conduct Rules. Now, these essentially apply to the All India Services. Now, we know that there are three All India Services, one being Indian Administrative Service, thereafter Indian Police Service, and then thirdly, the Indian Forest Service. A part of the federal structure of the country, their whole accountability, their whole structure is governed by Article 312 of the Constitution of India. So this is what the AIS conduct rules come in. They apply only to IAS, IPS and IFS. Thereafter, we have the Central Civil Service Conduct Rules, which apply to those cadres, those services which do not function within a cadre. So, for example, we have the Indian Foreign Service, the Indian Revenue Service, Central Excise and Customs. All of these are governed by the Central Civil Service Conduct Rules that came in the year 1964. Now, if you were to comprehensively look at the origin as to how exactly and who came up with the idea as to civil services being governed under a set of rules and guidelines, well, it was Lal Bahadur Shastri. Now, he set up a committee, the first committee being Santhanam Committee in the year 1962, that essentially laid the framework for the AIS Conduct Rules and the CCS Conduct Rules. Thereafter, we had the Hota Committee. And finally, of late, we have had the second ARC report. All of these three have, in fact, at some point or the other, campaigned for extensive reforms. An extensive structure was laid down insofar as how a civil servant should conduct and behave in their discharge of duties. Now, when you go forward, you understand that, well, these rules are restrictive. They are largely restrictive. Why? Because, well, you have an individual who is in a position of great power, a great responsibility is bestowed on him, and so there are restrictions on how an individual of a part of the civil service should behave. So first, we have the expected ones. The person should have high ethical standards, integrity, and honesty, a prerequisite for any civil servant. Political neutrality is explicitly mentioned. Why? Because you want continuity in the government. You do not want allegiances to be developed to a political party or an ideology. The civil service is a neutral authority, a neutral body in place. At the same time, promoting the principles of merit, fairness and impartiality. That you will not give in to bias but be completely objective in your assessment and decision making is expected of a civil servant. Thereafter, accountability, transparency, responsiveness, good conduct, good behavior in dealing with the public, all part of the essential tenets of the conduct rules for any civil servant. However, these are the more general ones, the more expected ones. When you go deep into the civil service conduct rules, you understand that, well, it essentially covers everything, from the ambiguous to the specific. For example, the rule number 3 of the CCS rules, the AIS rules, in fact says that every member of the service shall at times maintain absolute integrity and devotion to duty, and shall do nothing which is unbecoming of a member of the service. Now, this is a vaguely worded term. For example, promotion of casteism is not exactly mentioned, but then what if one were to be casteist? Well, would that be considered unbecoming of a civil servant? Absolutely. So these vaguely worded comments are essentially adding to the whole interpretation juxtaposition that's happening. No one is able to figure out what exactly is in the law and what exactly is outside the ambit of the law. Then you have some specific regulations too. For example, a civil servant can't influence directly or indirectly any particular entity for securing employment for any member of his family. No favors can be asked. No, you rub my back and I shall rub yours. That's not allowed. Then you have some other laws. The laws that relate to dowry and gifts. Dowry, which is essentially a major curse in the Indian society. Well, the practical ramifications of that is that, well, when an individual is selected in the coveted civil service, the societal norm is that expensive gifts are traded so as to secure alliance with that particular family. However, if you go by the AIS rules, you look at that a civil servant shall not give or take or abet the taking of dowry. No engagement there. If you were to do so, it's in direct contravention of the civil service conduct rules, the AIS conduct rules. Demanding directly or indirectly from the parents or anyone from the family any dowry is again prohibited under the AIS rules. Now, how much of that is followed is again, I'll leave that for the viewer to answer. Again, at the same time, when you discuss gifts, well, there are major problems with gifts too, because gifts can be used to influence a civil servant in a position of authority. Well, the AIS rules also thought of that. So, for example, in a personal ceremony, you are allowed to gain or accept a gift of up to a maximum of 25,000 rupees. If you were to do more than that, if you were to accept a gift of more than that, well, you need to have written sanction from your superiors. At the same time, no member of the service shall accept any gift without the sanction of the superiors exceeding rupees 5,000, which is outside personal ceremonies. Now, of late, an amendment has also been made. Earlier, if a civil servant was part of a foreign delegation and if gifts were exchanged, well, he or she wouldn't be allowed to keep the gift. That would in fact be reduced and returned to the treasury, the Tosh Khana. But of late, the amendments say that up to a maximum of 25,000 rupees, if a gift is valued and if the gift is exchanged with a civil servant who is part of a foreign delegation, official foreign delegation, well, then the person can keep it. Imagine all of this complexities being simplified if the same was being followed in a Western neighboring country. All problems originating from a sitting prime minister accepting a gift and not returning it to the Tosh Khana. Well, the Indian constitution, the Indian rules have taken care of that problem. Moving forward, now you look at the Official Secrets Act. So any information in discharge of the duties, which is part and of relevance to the national security, the national realm, well, you cannot discuss that. You cannot give it out. So that's part of the Official Secrets Act too, which is why a lot of restriction is placed on the freedom of expression of an individual who is part of the civil service. Now I'm reminded of a very important, in fact a very intriguing quote by Humphrey Appleby, who portrays the permanent representative of the minister in the popular series Yes Minister. And he says that the Official Secrets Act is not to protect secrets, but it is to protect officials. Indeed, again, the connotations of that are open for interpretation, but the fact remains, the truth remains, that Official Secrets Act is something that binds down civil servants so as to protect national interest, national security. Going forward, now we look at the expression, the restriction on freedom of expression for civil servants. Now, the whole rule says that you cannot express any sentiment which is in contravention to the policy or the stand of the government. You cannot criticize government decisions. You cannot speak ill of government policy. Obviously, you cannot do the rest. You cannot incite hate, enmity, all of that is there. But insofar as the interaction between the executive and the political structure is concerned, well, the executive cannot criticize at all to any extent. That's what the accepted norm was. However, what happened essentially was that why are these restrictions were imposed on the civil servants is important to be understood now. As I told you, the restriction is present. The civil servants do not enjoy absolute freedom of expression. So reasonable restrictions, as mentioned in Article 19, do apply to civil servants. But the question so remains that with the changing nature of communications, with communications now going online in the digital sphere, so what exactly is the line? Where exactly is the line to be drawn? So now the governmental norm says that, well, you can use social media for promotion of policies, for grievance redressal. However, more often than not, one finds that the civil servants engage in shameless self-promotion, to the extent that a serving IAS is shifted out from election duty after he is caught and is exposing in a photo where he is supposed and seen to be showing off. So that demarcation needs to be clearer, especially with the advent of new forms of tech and online engagement. At the same time, you look at civil servants across the country with a huge fan following on YouTube, a cult-like following on YouTube. Now, how much of the content is policy and say a policy promotion, and how much of that content is self-promotion is again a decision that you, my viewer, are in the best position to make. Going forward now, so when it comes to the freedom of expression as part of the civil service conduct rules, there are two very important judgments that one must consider. Number one is by the Tripura High Court. Now, the Tripura High Court says that government servants are entitled to hold and express their political beliefs subject to restrictions. The restrictions as in Article 19, Clause 2. At the same time, the Kerala High Court says that one cannot be prevented from expressing his or her views merely because one is a government employee. Both of these judgments essentially protecting the freedom of expression for a person who is engaged in the civil service or government service. In fact, these courts have observed that fair and constructive criticism is welcome, but the criticism should be in consonance with the principles that are enshrined in our Constitution. They cannot be subversive to the very ideas that are mentioned in the Constitution. However, these are again extremely restrictive terms, and they do limit, to a certain extent, on paper at least, the engagements of the civil service with the media. In fact, the civil servants are allowed to speak to the media when on the field posting, when it's required in the discharge of their official duties. However, with civil servants now making appearances in award shows and TEDx talks and blog posts and podcasts, well, one wonders how much of that again is policy promotion, and one wonders again how much of that is shameless self-promotion. Going forward, so what were the second ARC recommendations? What exactly did the ARC say so as to comprehensively change the civil service conduct rules? Well, the ARC had a very simple mechanism. It advocated for a three-tier system. What essentially it laid down was that there should be a clear and concise statement, a preamble of sorts that will guide the civil service conduct rules. Thereafter, you will have the broad principles that will govern the behavior and the dealings of an individual who is a civil servant. And finally, you will have exact information, avoiding ambiguity about the do's and don'ts. A specific code of conduct that will specify a list of acceptable and unacceptable behavior and actions. Now, all of these were recommended by the ARC and are under consideration. However, it is again important for both of us, you, my viewer, and I, to ask this question as to what changes would you like to see in the civil service conduct rules so that they become better empowered to serve the aspirations and the needs of 21st century India. Bear in mind, these rules are amended from time to time. Every government that comes in makes an amendment to its liking so as to facilitate or probably degrade the interaction of the civil service with the polity. So that question remains important for you to consider. How can we better empower our civil service? After all, these particular rules were drafted in 1960, close to 70 years ago, and even though they have been amended, probably do not capture the whole essence of, say, civil service and citizen interaction. Which is why it becomes important for us to consider that there may be a renewed thrust that may be needed to make sure that civil service conduct rules are effectively empowering the guy or the person in place to basically deliver on the needs and the aspirations of the people. On that note, before I wrap up this very short presentation on Study IQ IAS, well, if you enjoyed this presentation on civil service conduct rules and the history of it and what exactly are the ramifications of it, well, do ensure and I request you to check out the other presentations on current affairs, hot topics of the day. And with that, we come to the end of this special presentation. Till I see you again the next time, it's a wrap from Bhuvan for Study